I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Welcome to the show this week. Eric Chemi, your host as always. Today I'm joined by Zack Butcher. He is a head of product and founding engineer at Tetrate. It's an enterprise service mesh company. Very, very high-tech stuff, right? This is a high-tech company. It's a little bit over my head, so I'm a little bit nervous about the interview, but Zack seems like a friendly guy, and I hope he's going to walk me through some of my boneheaded questions. Zack, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I guess to get us rolling. I was one of the original engineers here at Tetrate, actually the first one to join our two founders.
The first one. So it was all on you.
Yeah. So hopefully we didn't screw it up too bad. You know, we've gone. We made it 4 more years after that, and we're still growing strong with more than 120 people as well. So we've come a long way since the three of us way back. But yeah, and I've worn a bunch of different hats, like you mentioned. I help lead our product team these days. I do a lot of technical sales. I do a lot of writing, all kinds of different things, including actually, I help work a good bit with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to help write some of the security standards for the U.S. federal government's microservice deployments as well. And before then, I worked on at Google on a whole bunch of different stuff. If you go and use Google Cloud, you use code that I helped create as well, and the service mesh there at Google as well.
And your code is still there? Because if you left to Google about 4 years ago, I don't know how quickly they're ripping code out and putting new stuff in.
A good bit of it's still there. So I worked on some of the core. If you go and use GCP, you make a project. Projects I worked on for quite a long time. Project creation was my baby. For in the way that somebody says, "Hey, do you mind holding my baby for a minute?" and then they leave and they never come back, and so it's your baby now. So it was my baby.
You were the one that got handed it, or you're the one that ran away?
They got handed it, unfortunately. It was a great spot to be, though. We delivered a bunch of cool stuff like the GCP identity and access management framework, which does a bunch of cool stuff, hierarchical permissions, all that kind of thing. That I now, wearing a different hat at Tetrate, do research and access control with the folks over at NIST in very similar things. So it's kind of a nice small world. A lot of the experience at Google directly translated over to a lot of the things that we're doing at Tetrate with the service mesh.
Your LinkedIn says you graduated in 2014. Auburn, that's where Tim Cook went. That's where Cam Newton went. That's where Charles Barkley went. So some big names there.
Rarefied air.
But your LinkedIn also says for 2 years, it sounds like while you were in college, it looks like you worked at Colonial Pipeline Company, which I think has only one claim to fame. And we know what that is. So, and you were not there for that because you left 8 years ago, right, when you graduated. Yeah. So what was that experience like? And what was it like hearing about everything that happened with them about a year or two ago?
Yeah, it was pretty surreal. So it was a phenomenal experience. I worked there as an intern, kind of a glorified intern. We called it co-op for about 18 months there with the crew there. They're, a really interesting business. Really, I kind of joke. I left that and went to Google, and Google makes less money per employee than the oil pipeline did, right? Which everybody talks about how much money Google makes. And so it's kind of funny to see. It was a phenomenal learning experience for me because it was a very small team. And so it was a little bit surreal then to see, 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, the Colonial Pipeline hack, the ransomware attack there. And I think I mentioned earlier in the call, I helped write some of the government security standards for microservice security. In the executive order that came out in the wake of that ransomware attack that mandated a zero trust security posture for every agency in the federal government. In fact, actually, some of the papers I helped write were part of that mandate. So it's kind of funny to go full circle to have worked there at the company. I worked in IT, not in the security side of the house. Have left, been gone for 8 years, see them in the news again, and stuff that I work on now is directly addresses some of the security problems and security holes there. So it's kind of a cool, very, very nice full circle. I kind of laughed about it when it happened because I was like, wow, you'll never believe.
And it is unique that you've had that experience then coming back full circle now, because so much of what Tetrate does is about the world of cybersecurity, right? ZeroTrust architecture, preventing cyber attacks. Where do we even begin? I guess let's start with ZeroTrust architecture. It's I mean, in the tech world, a pretty common phrase. In the normal world, right? It's not that common. I think the normal world, they're still catching up to two-factor authentication, for example, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
kind of like a now kind of household name, but
Yeah,
zero trust. What does that mean? Who am I not trusting? Who did I used to
yeah,
trust? Why is there no trust? Is trust good or bad? Like help
yeah.
explain this
I think
to a bonehead
yeah,
like me.
yeah, yeah. So I actually hate the name Zero Trust. So first off, I kind of because it's the opposite of that. It's not that we don't trust anything; it's that we're actually elevating what we trust to a higher layer. So you may be familiar with the adage, accessibility is authorization. And that's an old networking adage. But the way that this manifests is you probably worked for companies in the past that to get on the corporate network, you have to go like start up a VPN on your machine, right? And that's really what that's saying is I'm on the corporate network. I have a privileged position. Therefore, I can access some corporate system, some files in our shared folders, some documents, whatever it is, right? What Zero Trust is really saying is that we don't want to grant access to some files on the shared drive or some resource in our organization based on the fact that you're on the network. Because the reality is that today something on the network is compromised, right? In your infrastructure, something in your infrastructure is compromised. You don't know what it is. We don't know what it is, but the working assumption is that some level is if there's a persistent attacker that is going to be compromised.
So just
So
because
we
I've
don't
gotten on doesn't mean I should be able to get access. But then it's like,
exactly.
what's the point of getting on then? If I got
Yeah,
on, it's to get access. If you tell me if I'm on and I don't have access, then where am I, like purgatory? Like
exactly.
what am
So
I
what
what am
we
I doing?
yeah. And so that gets into things like the two-factor authentication that you talk about. So rather than saying because you're on the network you get access, instead we want to say log in, prove to me that you're not just on the network, but you actually are who you say that you are. Authenticate yourself. Do, for example, a two-factor authentication. And instead of saying, great, you're on the network, you can access it, we hand that credential, what we would call an authenticated credential, because I can verify that you are who you say that you are. And how we do that verification, that's what two-factor authentication is, one way that we might do that. Then we're going to grant you access or not based on who you are rather than where you're positioned, right? So it's not just that you're on the VPN, it's that you've logged in and authenticated yourself. So the access that I grant you is based on your identity, not based on the fact that you're on the right corporate network. And so then what can happen is that we can get rid of the idea of being on the corporate network. And
Right. Because
now you
now it
don't
doesn't
need to be on a
matter.
VPN because it doesn't matter because the access is protected by identity. And so any place that you can authenticate yourself, that you can prove your identity, then you can access the
How
resource.
often do I have
And
to prove myself? Every time I try to access the next file, I got to reprove. Like that's got to be there's a little bit of an art there, right? Because you got false positives
yeah,
and false negatives. Like how many times, sort of like the bank vault, like how many doors are going to be in this vault every time I move forward, or the
yeah.
kings, the moat, and there's another door, then there's another door.
Yeah, and so fortunately, when we talk about authentication, that is something that doesn't have a false positive, right? So if we're doing authentication correctly, by its nature, what we're doing is taking some proofs and asserting that they're you based on those proofs and the way that our system is set up. There's more advanced ways that we can start to do this than even just like two-factor authentication. And so the kind of thing that's in vogue now would be risk-based authentication. So, hey, you logged in. That's great. But actually, I see that you logged in from your normal computer. And I see, most of the time you log in with that computer. Therefore, I'm going to trust you. But, and you've probably seen this when you go and log in online somewhere, maybe you get a
New
notification that says, hey,
computer.
you're not on your
Right.
normal
Right.
device,
Okay.
right? That's risk-based authentication. But at the end of the day, we're going to get an authenticated principal, whether it's risk-based or two-factor authentication or the fact that you use an OTP, a one-time code, whatever it is, the system gets this authenticated principal. And then that's what we write policy about when we restrict access.
So how does zero trust architecture differ from other forms of
Yeah.
cybersecurity?
So the most traditional defense that we see, and this is kind of part of where the zero trust name comes in, it would be a perimeter-based security model. So I think a lot of people are familiar with this idea that I have the DMZ, right? And to get into the corporate network, you have to go through the DMZ, and then behind that, you might have an application zone and a data zone, for example. And so we would do that with network appliances. We would create these segmentations that could not communicate across to each other. So a machine in one segment can't talk to a machine in another segment unless we grant that network access. And that's that idea of authorization, the reachability. If I can actually establish a connection between us, then I'm authorized to do it. That comes from that micro-segmentation based world, or that segmentation based world with perimeter security. And so now what we're moving to is a world where we do that same kind of authentication and authorization, the same kind of security policy, not just at the front door, at the perimeter. Do you think perimeter security kind of like a castle, right? I have big walls, I have one gate through, and I do all my security checks at the gate. And then once you're in, you're free. Well, the idea of zero trust is shrinking the perimeter that you trust, shrinking that castle, so that ideally you have one castle around every single instance of every single application. And so that any communication between any parts of your system, you can apply all of the security policy, authentication, authorization, whatever kind of risk-based mitigations, you can do whatever the policy is that's appropriate for your business. You can start to apply there at the application instance itself and not at the front door. So now, if you go back to what I originally said with zero trust, the mental model is that somebody's compromised your network already. That's why we want to do that authentication and authorization, not at the front door, but they're already inside the castle. So we need to protect at every site along the way.
Right. So then who are your customers right now? What are you getting? Like, what is the kind of the pitch, the sales pitch? It's like what type of customer, what's their
Yeah.
current cybersecurity platform look like, and how are you convincing them to make a switch to you?
Yeah. So a lot of our customers are in some of the most highly regulated industries. So we're talking about the defense industry. We're talking about financial tech. We're talking about healthcare, for example, are three big verticals where we do very well. And that's because those are all places that are security first and that are highly regulated. So what is the sales pitch? The pitch is that there's a litany of different security controls that you need to implement for your particular regulatory regime. If you're in financial tech, maybe that's PCI. If you're in the DoD, maybe that's FedRAMP for a FedRAMP environment, like FedRAMP moderate, for example, to be able to run government workloads. And whichever it is, based on the environment you're in, there's a bunch of common controls that you need to implement. You need to implement encryption in transit. You need authentication and authorization, like I talked about. You need telemetry out of the system so that you can see that policies that you're putting in place are actually being enforced. And you need to be able to manage how applications on your network communicate with each other. And that's fundamentally what we come in and start to do with the service mesh, is provide kind of a baseline set primitives to be able to do a lot of the security controls at runtime, but in a way that's not really invasive. Most of the time, if I'm going to do this in an organization, I have to do it for every application. And so I'm a big company, I'm a large bank. I have thousands of applications. And so suddenly to do something like encryption in transit for all 1,000 applications, that becomes, like a 4-year project to go to every single one and get them to implement it and do the education, do the integrations, update the applications and all of that. It's incredibly expensive and painful. Using the service mesh, one of the biggest techniques is that we can go in and start to do all of those things, encryption in transit, observability, traffic management, without having to be invasive for the application. And we do that by kind of pretending to be the network for the application, if you will. And by pretending.
Wait, what do you mean? What do you mean pretending to be the network? Wait a minute.
Yeah. So what we do is we put in what we would call a sidecar proxy. So a network proxy that you think of like an ELB in Amazon is one kind of network proxy. We put an instance of that proxy beside every instance of your application. And when your application communicates out over the network, it actually talks to the proxy. And that proxy then forwards the request on to a destination. And the same way, if I have that proxy there and somebody calls me over the network, When that connection comes in, it actually goes to the proxy first. The proxy can apply policy, it can generate metrics, it can perform authentication and authorization for you. And then once all that passes, it can hand the requests into the application. And so that's that idea. If we go back to that castle analogy where we have the gates that guards the entrance, and that's where we do all of our checks. That's where the guards are that check everybody coming in. We can think of the sidecar proxy as being the walls and the gate there that's around every instance of our application rather than just being at the big front door.
What are the ways that enterprises can defend themselves right now? There's so many cyber attacks, ransomware attacks. Where do they begin in terms of like, okay, this is the most important 3 things that you can do?
Yeah, so there's a ton because the surface area is huge, right? So the service mesh is awesome and it covers a lot of really important runtime security capabilities, but that's really a small story of the overall security posture that needs to happen. So where I would suggest that folks start is with actually some documentation from NIST, even if you're in the private sector, not a government agency or similar. NIST actually puts out a set of documents called the cybersecurity framework. That cybersecurity framework kind of lays out how to assess your security posture and improve it incrementally based on the needs of your organization. So it's not a one size fits all, just do these things and you'll be secure, but it outlines a set of processes to basically repeat kind of 5 core activities to identify what you have in your system, to start to develop strategies to protect it, to develop strategies to monitor it, to remediate when there's a problem, and ultimately recover operations when there is a security incident. And that CSF, the cybersecurity framework, kind of lays out across those 5 core categories different levels that your organization can be at and how you might go and progress from one level to the next. So it's a great framework for putting yourself into context, understanding where you are, and then navigating to a better spot if that's appropriate. You may not need to. You may be in a fine spot for your organization and the risks that you have.
What's your view on ransomware? Should companies pay the money or get
That's
creative?
a fun one. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? This is one where it's kind of challenging, right? So from a business continuity perspective, you want to pay the ransomware, right? We know, Colonial Pipeline was particularly high visibility, but the fact is that there's been a huge number of ransomware attacks across the industry and across sectors that just have had less visible impact. And most of the time, folks pay because it gets your business operating again. And the fact of the matter is that the amount of money that like Colonial had to pay relative to the profit that they make from operating is really not that large. Now the problem is that when you pay ransomware attackers, that just perpetuates their ability to continue to attack.
And if they
Right?
could get in the first place, then they could just do it again. Couldn't they just take the money and just do it again? Or if they knew
Yeah,
that
hopefully,
Colonial could afford it, then double the rate, triple the rate, add a
yeah,
zero to it.
and so this gets into all the kind of nasty side, right? So
Yeah.
hopefully you've done like network, mitigations to protect yourself again before you paid the ransom and similar, but there's really no guarantee, right? And that's why, if you go and contact, for example, the FBI, or there's actually new cybersecurity bureaus, there's a new commission that was set up in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline attack. Its whole purpose is to help industry when they are attacked in this way. They would much rather see you go contact them. They have some spectacularly capable folks there to be able to go and help mitigate the problem. You should definitely go to the federal government when you think it's a foreign national attacker on key systems like that, right? Maybe if Colonial had a sin in this whole thing, it was waiting a little bit too long to get the right government agencies involved, given the criticality of their business. And that's one of the reasons that cybersecurity framework is so nice, because one of the big things that it emphasizes is understanding how important your business is in the global supply chain. The fact of the matter is that Colonial Pipeline is responsible for delivering about 50% of the finished petroleum product, gasoline, kerosene, diesel, jet fuel, ship fuel, that gets used by the East Coast of the US.
That's
That's a
important.
hugely
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
piece of infrastructure. The security bar for things that they do should be second to none, right? It should really be some of the most secure infrastructure that exists. Unfortunately, it appears that it's not, right? And so, that's something that we need to get better at as an industry. Is it good to pay a ransomware attacker in your particular case or not? It's really hard to say. But in general, paying ransomware attackers perpetuates uh, ransomware attackers.
Yeah, that's certainly a difficult conversation. We're not going to solve it here on this podcast. Currently, who would you say is the makeup? Like, what is the makeup of the hackers, the cyber attackers, the ransomware guys? Is it foreign nationals? Is it just someone looking to disrupt? Is it just someone just testing things out? What's the current sort of
Yeah.
pie chart of who those people look like?
So it's all the above, right? Now I will say that you generally don't see large scale cyber attacks perpetuated from U.S. soil because we tend to be relatively good. Even though the government gets a bad rap for IT security things, the FBI is like pretty good at its job, right? And so we usually don't get these things perpetuated on U.S. soil because U.S. Enforcement agencies are going to act aggressively, right? So when we see it, we tend to see cyber attacks proliferate from other parts of the world, right? Places where it is that are heavily embargoed, so it's hard to get currency. That's one of the big, Russia comes to mind, right? Is one example. We certainly know that the Department of Defense put out advisories to the public warning that because of the Ukraine war, we were likely to see more ransomware attacks because that's a way to get money in the coffers, right?
I never thought
Um,
about that. I want to pause here because I never thought about the connection between once you sanction the currency, you encourage the attackers because they literally need to raise money, and that's their way of getting the money.
Yeah, and
I
I
didn't think
mean,
about
and if
that.
you look, these ransomwares are typically paid in a cryptocurrency because it can then be laundered, can be washed, and then traded out for real currency in places where it's harder, right? And so yeah, so we typically see, when it comes to nation state attackers, it's going to be nations that are otherwise embargoed or can't participate in the global economy, right? North Korea, Russia, Iran are three places that traditionally have had teams of attackers, right? And just in general, because of the skill set in that part of the world, and because of the economic conditions across some of those areas, you're more likely to get combined with weaker law enforcement for uh, hacking activities against foreign nations or companies that are in foreign nations. All that kind of blends together to make it a more attractive environment for folks that are going to do that kind of a thing, right? It tends to not be places in Western Europe because law enforcement is better able to track it down, and it tends to be that the economic conditions aren't conducive for it. If you have that set of skills, you can make good enough money doing legal things that it's not as attractive to do something that risks you going to jail for a very long time.
If a company uses your product, are they basically perfectly secure from an attack? Like, is there anything that
Oh,
keeps you
absolutely
up at
not.
night?
No,
No. Like,
nobody can be, nobody's going to be absolutely safe from everything, right? We've seen so many different vectors of attack. If we think about one, before Colonial, what was the attack that we were all talking about? It was solar winds,
yeah.
right? And that was an entirely different attack vector than those. And a lot of system, an attack in the style of solar winds is harder to mitigate with some of the runtime controls that you might have because fundamentally that was a privilege escalation, right? They were able to go mint trusted credentials. So even if you were doing zero trust things and making sure there was authentication and authorization every step along the way, there's still ways that I can, for example, steal your credentials and act as you, right? Or trick the system into minting an admin credential, and then I can use that admin credential to go act on the system. And maybe it doesn't set off alarms because we have the right to trust posture. We're using and it's a good account that's doing it, right? So no one single system is going to protect you from every kind of attack. That's just not realistic.
How do
But what
you?
I can,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
yeah, well, what I can say is that the service mesh does a whole lot, and Tetrate's product on top of the service mesh does a whole lot to help mitigate a bunch of common attack vectors at runtime. and help implement the base components that you need to start to realize that zero trust architecture. So to have encryption in transit so that clear text communication can't be tampered with, to have a policy enforcement point so that as you start to implement policy that used to be at the front gate, you can implement it by applications, right? But you still have to use the system correctly, configure it correctly, and similar. So we help, but it's never going to be everything.
How does a client, let's say a possible client of yours, how do they decide, okay, well, you're zero trust, there's another, like there's thousands of companies out there, they're using a lot of the same buzzwords. How can they figure out, well, I should use you and not your competitor? Like what's the difference? Because it's hard to see the difference. You can't look at the code, good luck figuring that out.
Yeah, so you need to look at the surrounding proof points, right? So one, look at the other customers that they're serving, right? We, like I mentioned, have quite a few large amount of our customers are in the Department of Defense, are in financial industry, are in the health industry, right? These are the places where security is forefront and matters the most. If you're looking for signals, that's probably a stronger signal than somebody who's doing a bunch of B2C apps, for example. Not to minimize the importance of security when it comes to B2C applications, like don't get me wrong, it matters a ton. But that's the first proof point to look at. What are the types of customers that are going there, and what are the concerns that they have? If my security concerns are similar to some of theirs, I'm probably in a good spot, right? So that's one of the first points to look at. Two, look at the team, right? So one of the things that definitely differentiates Tetrate in this space is that we very closely work with NIST here. So I think I mentioned at the beginning of the call that I am literally the co-author for the U.S. government's microservice security recommendations, right? Which are becoming more and more enforced because of executive orders like the one following Colonial Pipeline, right? So look at the folks that are involved in the product, right? And the involvement that they have in the security space in general and in the particular area that you're looking at in particular, right? Those are going to be two of the biggest proof points. And then, third, maybe ask to talk to some of those other customers, right? So any reputable vendor is going to be more than happy to set you up to have an interview with a current successful customer, and likely that they should be able to pair you up with somebody close to your industry as well to be able to get some insights there.
Can you share? Can you share some of your big name customers? I don't know how secret that is.
Yeah, so we have a bunch on our website. So you can go to the homepage and see, folks like VISA and Freddie Mac are two of our earliest customers. We have, folks like FICO as well. The U.S. Air Force, and particularly the Platform One program, who's responsible for building a zero trust platform for the Department of Defense, are all customers of ours. And you can go read about some of their use cases and things on our own website.
One of the things that I noticed, there's a big push to talk about Istio. Istio, Istio on your Istio, site, and your LinkedIn. You were working on Istio at Google. So what is the relationship for Istio.io? You were working on it at Google, but here it is at Tetrate. What is the relationship of Istio, and how important is it to what you're doing? And what is it for people who don't know?
Yeah, and I also actually wrote the book Istio Up and Running for O'Reilly.
You've written a lot.
Yeah, a couple of one or two things. Yeah. So Istio, so when I've been talking about the service mesh this whole time, Istio is a service mesh. In general, the service mesh is an architectural pattern. It's that idea of putting that network proxy next to the application, using that to enforce all the policy, do encryption, give visibility. That's the service mesh pattern. But Istio is a particular implementation of the service mesh, and it's the one that's most widely used. I worked on the original team to help create it back at Google, and that was based on some of the work that we did internally to Google. We had a very similar piece in our architecture. We didn't call it the service mesh at the time, but we do now. And we had that piece of technology, and it was very successful for what we used it for, and we wanted to go and open source it in a very similar way that Google went and open sourced and built Kubernetes. So we did the same thing for Istio to help solve exactly the set of problems that we're talking about.
So it was developed at Google, became open source, and now anyone can use it, including you're using it at Tetrate. Is that the right understanding of that?
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't solely Google that developed it. In fact, we came out and it started as a partnership between Google and IBM. The
Okay.
thing grew to include Red Hat before the acquisition, included early in the early days folks like Cisco as well, for example. So it was a really great cross industry swath of folks that came together to build this technology. And so at Tetrate, what we do is take Istio as the foundation for our product and layer capabilities on top that help close that gap for enterprise users. You can imagine, based on a bunch of the stuff that we talked about, things like access management, things like audit, things like controls and compliance, really how you can take the service mesh and use it in a complex enterprise environment with a central security team and a platform team and 1,000 app developers. How do you hand it to them in a way that it's safe and they don't cut themselves on it? And that's exactly what our product does.
What's your home setup like? How secure is your actual regular home computer? You got all kinds of crazy stuff there because if I understand right, you're back home in Alabama, right? You're working
Yeah.
remotely, so it's got to be secured. It's all based on like what you're doing on that home computer.
Yeah, I mean, and we're doing a bunch of stuff where that's not too special, right? So like, we don't actually have a corporate network. We're using, a lot of zero trust principles. The access to all of our documents at the company is tied to logins, right, and not tied to a privileged network. In that way, we're not really going out of our way to do crazy secure setups. Of course, things like physical security keys are super key, right? Those are a really important uh, tool when you're worried about compromising your account. And specifically, most people that are not going to be directly targeted don't need to worry, right? But if your threat model includes people persistently and directly targeting your identity, then you need a set of tools like physical security tokens. You need a variety of different things. Hopefully, fortunately, that's not the vast majority of folks in the world. And simply using a password manager, having two-factor authentication, ideally not with your phone, but with like an OTP token or a generator, a physical token generator of some kind, although not the old school RSA ones.
Would you
Do
walk me
something
through
like
that? Because I'm
YubiKey.
doing it. I'm just doing it on my phone. I've just got like one of those authenticator apps on my phone.
Yeah, so that's a good way to do it too. I would suggest like a YubiKey, or Google has Titan keys, are physical security devices that do a little bit of a stronger, cryptographically speaking, a little bit of a stronger dance than just like a 6-digit code, right? So one of those physical access tokens is a good thing to have. That's a good security measure and a good second factor. The reason, for example, you're like SMS is not a good second factor if you're worried about on a
Oh, when
threat
you
model
said
where
not your
you're
phone, you meant not like the text to your phone. You didn't mean like
yeah. So you
avoiding the
yeah. So
apps on the phone. Yeah.
yeah, using one of the authenticator apps for your phone is definitely a step better. So like worst would be SMS,
Right.
right? Because if you're the subject of an attack, somebody can do something like SIM jacking or similar
Right.
to intercept those messages, right? Again, that's not a common attack vector, but if your threat model is someone is really trying to get my stuff, then you do need to worry about that potentially. And so then something like an authenticator app on your cell phone is one step better, right? And that gives you a reasonably strong assurance. The best that you could do would be a physical security token. And again, not the old school RSA
Yeah.
tokens, but
Why
a
did you say
modern.
not? Why did you say not? Are they just too
Yeah.
old and not as good? But like it's kind of
Yeah.
the same
So,
idea. The
yeah.
theory's the same.
Yeah, basically, those old school tokens that you get are a little bit weaker, cryptographically speaking. So you can basically, if I know the time and the seed, I can go and guess your sequence, right? And so there's attacks that can leak that sequence potentially. Whereas things like YubiKey or Titan keys from Google use a certificate, and so they use the more traditional PKI infrastructure to assert that this is accurate or not. So you have a little bit of a stronger kind of baseline set of primitives or principles that you're building your security posture on compared to the earlier kind of RSA key tokens.
And finally, what's it like for you being in a way out of the rat race of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley? You're
Yeah.
back, you're home. You're not in one of those traditional like, oh, I'm not in Austin or New York City or San Francisco. What is
Yeah.
that perspective like for you being away from it all?
Yeah, it's been nice. So I was in San Francisco. I was in San Francisco City proper. I lived in the Mission for about 6 years. Absolutely loved it. As with a bunch of people during COVID, I was actually by myself. My roommate moved out and got married, and so I was by myself right as COVID hit, and and alone for like 9 months in a tiny little apartment. So I went and decided to move back closer to my family here in Alabama, in Birmingham, all the way. And so I've really enjoyed it, right? Uh, Certainly things like the cheaper cost of living are a really nice perk. I already work remotely and had worked remotely for several years, both at Tetrate, where we're totally remote, as well as at Google. I actually worked remotely as well. So I was used to that part of it. It's been really nice. I still live in a part where I can walk around a decent little bit. I have, funnily enough, more James Beard award-winning restaurants that I can walk to here in Birmingham than I did in San Francisco. So I've been enjoying it quite a bit. It definitely is a little weird to be cut off from some of the network. There is a really, for folks that are kind of, especially earlier in their career and debating, moving out to the Bay Area or not, I definitely think it's worthwhile to build that network, right?
Right. Do it till you're 30 and then get out. Meet your friends and then leave.
Exactly. But yeah, so it's been good. Both are great, but it's a set of trade-offs, and it's hard to beat the lower cost of living, more space that you get from some of the other parts of the country.
Zach, I appreciate the time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I love that you're just so open to really getting into the weeds on some of this stuff and walking me through. Just great. Thank you so much for the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. It's been great.
All right. Thanks to Zack Butcher from Tetrate for joining, and for all you listening and watching out there. We'll see you next time. Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.